Hello, everybody. Welcome to my glaze course open house. Just making sure. I saw like the participant number went down, but now it's going back up. So it's letting all you guys in. So good to see you. Oh, okay. So we have about 5 minutes just to kind of get sorted before we start. But hi, I'm Sue McLeod, in case we haven't met before. And so I'm just going to spend the next 5 minutes just making sure you know that you can use the chat. So I'm on a desktop computer, so I'm not sure how it looks on mobile, but on the right-hand side of my screen, there's a little chat window. And so if you could please, Mary says, I see it. Yeah, please say hello in the chat, and you could let me know where you are watching from today. That would be great, because I know we have people from all over the world. I live in Duke, British Columbia. So that's on Vancouver Island, which is just outside of Victoria, BC. So just a little small town just west of Victoria on the coast, on the west coast. Okay, here we go. We got Eve from Maryland and Joni from Ohio. Mary is from Cortez Island, BC. That's awesome, if that's what you mean. I could be totally wrong. Yes. Oh, that's so cool. Cortez Island. Is that off of Quadra Island? Yeah, you are my neighbor. Even more remote than Souk. Much more. Yeah, off of Quadra. Awesome. That's great. I've never been to Cortez. I've been to Quadra a few times. Danielle is from Boston, Massachusetts. Awesome. So welcome, everyone. So in this, it's technically a webinar, but I'm going to be giving a presentation where I'm going to kind of walk you through the glaze journey. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got started with glazes and kind of like the steps that I took along the way to get to, where I am now. And then I'm going to explain how, because I teach 3 online courses about glazes. So I have glaze mixing essentials, mastering glaze consistency, and then the art of glaze chemistry. So I have these 3 courses that kind of cover different aspects of glazes and glazing, and depending on kind of where you are on your glaze journey and what you're hoping to learn next, that there would be a different course that might be best for you to take right now. And so, I wanted to check. So when you guys all registered, it asked you whether you mix glazes from scratch or not, and whether you had a lot of experience with that, or if you were fairly new at it. So I've got the numbers here. So it looks like about half of you have never mixed glazes from scratch before. And then a small percentage of you mix glazes quite a lot. And then another majority of you mix glazes a little bit. So you have a little bit of experience. So that's really good for me to know, because some of my courses, like one of my courses will teach you how to mix glazes from scratch. And so that's probably the best course to start with for a lot of you, although it's not required that you mix glazes from scratch. Mastering glaze consistency is the course that is open for registration just this week. And so that course doesn't require that you mix your own glazes from scratch. So I'm going to talk all about all of these courses and kind of like if there's prerequisites or like, well, who would be the best person to take each of the courses. So then you guys can decide. And there will be time for questions at the end. And then I have an assistant, Laura, who's in here. She'll be monitoring the chat. So while I'm giving the presentation, I won't be watching. I won't be looking at your questions, but I will go back and answer some of them at the end. So if you want to save your questions till the end, the end of my little PowerPoint presentation, that might be best, but you can always kind of type them in as we go, as your questions come to you, and then Laura will be copying them into a document where I can just easily see them after the presentation. Okay, I'm going back to the chat. So Susan, oh, hi, Susan from Chemainus. So a couple local Vancouver Island-ish people and the general area. Awesome. And Massimo has taken a couple of my classes. So he's just here for information or just to like hang out, I think. So welcome, Massimo. That's awesome. Good to see you. Okay. So it is officially 10 a.m. Pacific time. So I'm going to kind of get started here. Oh, Kathy has taken one of my courses too. Yeah. So my goal for this is just to kind of give you an idea of like the difference between the 3 glaze courses that I offer, and just explain how each of them could possibly fit into your glaze journey. So officially, welcome to my glaze course open house. So I've never done anything like this before, but now that I've kind of got these 3 established courses that I'm teaching, I wanted to, I get a lot of questions about like, oh, which one should I take? And this is my experience, and therefore, which course should I take? And so I'm hoping to clear up a lot of those questions for you guys. So I'm Sue McLeod, and if you're just arriving, there is a chat window on the right. If you have any connection issues, there's like a little red reconnect button that you could always press that will kind of like refresh your screen. It's on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So just if you're having any sort of connection problems, you can try clicking that button. And so I'm going to get started with my presentation, and just know that I will be doing a Q&A at the end. So when I am giving the presentation, I'm going to be focusing on that, and then I will come back to the chat. So feel free to type into the chat, and then I'll go back and answer your questions afterwards. Okay, so let me get my PowerPoint presentation ready. Here we go. Presenter mode. Okay. Oh, Danielle says, I've taken a class about what the glaze materials do. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't even include that, but that's a little workshop. I'll talk about that today too. That's a little workshop that I offer as well. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. This thing takes a little bit of time to, hopefully this is going to work. There we go. Okay, and you should be able to still see me at the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to close the chat. Pardon me. I'm going to close the chat now. So just know that I'm going to come back and answer your questions at the end. I just don't want to be distracted by the chat. Okay. So can everyone see my slides before I switch the chat off? Can someone just say, yes, I can see this glaze course open house slide? That would be great. Yep. Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Okay, here. I think there's a little bit of lag. So perfect. Thank you all. Okay. So here we go. Glaze course open house. So I'm here today to give you a little more information about the 3 online courses that I teach, a bit about my background with glazes, and then just kind of like help you figure out if a glaze course would be great for you to take right now, and if so, which one would be best. So I have these 3 courses: glaze mixing essentials, mastering glaze consistency, and the art of glaze chemistry. I also have a workshop called What Do the Glaze Materials Do that I didn't include in this presentation, but I'll talk about that a little bit later, because that workshop is like an intro to what I teach in the art of glaze chemistry. Okay, so moving slides. There we go. Okay, so here we've got glaze mixing essentials, mastering glaze consistency, and the art of glaze chemistry. So these are the 3 main programs that I offer that will teach you specific skills and give you kind of a foundation of knowledge. Because glazes, like, we can just buy glazes at the store and glaze our pots. And then, there are some challenges around that. Some of us are going to want to go, move from using commercial glazes or glazes that someone else mixes for us to mixing our own glazes from scratch. And then, but so there's like, there's like the making of glazes, and then there's like the glazing of your pieces, which, I think any potter who's done any glazing before doesn't always work out the way that you hope it will, or the way that you had intended. And then there's sometimes where you finally figure out, you've like practiced glazing and you've fired pots and you've like put pots through the kiln over and over. And then you finally think that you've got your glazing figured out. And then you try, glaze a whole bunch of pots, and then they don't work out the way that you want them to. And so we always struggle with this consistency issue. It's like, everything that we thought we knew, all of a sudden nothing is making sense. Glazes can be very challenging. There's a lot of chemistry, like whether we understand the chemistry of glazes or not, there's a lot of chemistry taking place in the kiln, in the glaze bucket. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between the chemistry of the liquid glaze in the bucket that you're using to glaze your pots with, and then we put them in the kiln, and then another chemical, like a big chemical transformation, takes place as our solid glaze materials melt, and they melt into a liquid, and then they cool and solidify into a glass on our pots. So this is, I've been thinking a lot about the glaze journey and like the path that potters often take from the point, where you first get started with glazes, or like with pottery or ceramics. Pottery doesn't have to mean throwing pots on the wheel. You could be slab building, slip casting, any type of working with clay. And then we apply glazes onto our pots. So I call everything pots, even if they're not like vessels to hold liquid. I just find it's an easy word that we all understand, is like pots. So I'm going to just refer to pots throughout this presentation. But just know, like, if you're making tiles, or if you're making something that you wouldn't consider a pot, I'm also referring to that as well. So a lot of us, when we first start working with clay, the first time we glaze, it's with glazes that either came from a store, so commercial glazes, or glazes that someone else makes. Hopefully you can see my mouse. Glazes that someone else makes for you. So you might go to a community pottery studio where they provide the glazes for you. Maybe someone at that studio mixes the glazes. So I used to work for 6 years. I worked at a public pottery studio in Victoria called Cedar. It was at Cedar Hill Rec Center. And I was the ceramic studio technician. And so I would mix the glazes for the studio. And so everyone that came in to take classes, we had an open studio drop-in program. Everyone that came in to use our clay in our studio would use the glazes that the technicians made for the studio. So we had a rule that you couldn't bring in commercial glazes, and you couldn't use glazes that you mixed yourself, because we just wanted to protect our kilns and make sure that all of the glazes that are going into our kilns are for the correct temperature, and that they're not going to cause a big disaster. So most of us start out. So when I was first starting out, I signed up for, like, I hadn't even touched clay since grade 2. So I took a little pottery ceramics class when I was in grade 2, and I still have some of the pieces from that. And then we never had a ceramics program in high school. And then it was 2008 that I just signed up for a 2-year clay program at an art school. It's called Kootenai School of the Arts in Nelson, British Columbia. So some of you may have gone to that school, or you might be there now. It's now called Kootenai Studio Arts. And so when it was a 2-year program, diploma program. And so in our first year, we just used the glazes in the studio that the second years would make. And so my whole first year was just focused on getting better at working with the clay and understanding the glazing process. So there was no mixing glazes in our whole first year. And then in second year, the very first semester of second year, that's when we all started mixing glazes from scratch. So most of us start out by using commercial glazes or glazes that someone else makes. And then we start to, if you don't quit, I think a lot of people start pottery thinking that it's going to be like this wonderful, magical experience. And then they get frustrated because it takes a lot of work to get really good at it. But for those of us who persevere, and we, potters are so patient, and we get really good at experiencing failure, where we put things into the kiln, they come out looking horrible. Nothing works out the way that we wanted it to. Our pots crack, the clay cracks, the handles fall off, the glazes run onto the kiln shelves, and we keep going. And if you get to that point where you're like, okay, I'm in this, then eventually you inevitably want to learn more about glazes. And so you could then go to start mixing your own glazes from scratch. Or that might not be, like, if you don't have a studio at your home, that might not be a feasible option for you. But then, so if that's not an option for you, then what you want to focus on is, like, how do I get better at using the glazes that I have available to me? And that involves understanding glaze bucket chemistry. And so what I mean by that is, like, when we're first starting out, it's just like there's a glaze in a bucket or a container, and we stir it up, and we might paint it onto our pots, or we might be dipping our pots into the bucket. What's in the bucket is actually solid particles. So they're earthen materials, essentially rocks that are mined from the earth and ground up into fine powders. And then these fine powders are mixed together in a recipe with very specific proportions, so that they will melt in the kiln and turn into a glass on your pots. And the way those materials interact with the water in the bucket is what I refer to as glaze bucket chemistry. And so there's a relationship between the water in the bucket and the solid particles. So there's the ratio. Pardon me, I'm just like have a little frog in my throat. I'm just going to take a sip of water. There's the ratio of solid particles to water. So you could have a glaze that has a lot of water proportionately to the amount of solid glaze particles, or you could have a glaze that has very little water. And so we often would refer to a glaze that has a lot of water. It's very thin in the bucket, we get a thin application. Glazes that don't have much water seem very thick in the bucket, and we could have a thicker application. And sometimes if your glazes are too thick, they could run onto your kiln shelves. They could crawl. You could experience certain problems depending on the water content in your glaze. And the way that the water interacts with the glaze particles, there's a little bit of chemistry going on there as well. Clay particles. So every glaze, you might not know this, but every glaze has a bit of clay in the glaze recipe as well. So we have the clay that we use to make our pots, and then we have the glazes. Well, glazes also include a little bit of clay in them. And clay particles, when they come into contact with water, they act like magnets. And so there's, they have like a positive or negative charge depending on the chemistry going on. And so they can either attract each other and stick together or repel each other, you know, like if you have the same sides of a magnet, how they would kind of repel each other. Clay particles kind of work in that way. And so, and the way that the clay particles interact with each other and with the water, the chemistry behind that plays a big role in the way your glaze applies to your pots. And so you can, you know, most of us just add water until our glaze seems like it's a good consistency for dipping, but some glazes are going to have a higher viscosity. So viscosity is like the thickness of a liquid. Some glazes are going to be thicker with the same amount of water than other glazes. And so because of all this chemistry going on in the glaze bucket, it's not always a straightforward process like, okay, I add exactly this much water to my glaze, and every glaze gets the same amount of water, and then I get the same sort of application thickness on my pots and the same results every time. Every glaze recipe is going to react differently with the water, and so every glaze kind of needs to be it needs its own sort of process for mixing the glaze and adding the water to the glaze. I use a method called measuring specific gravity, which is just, it's a way where we weigh the glaze, we weigh a volume of glaze, and that gives us the density, and it tells us how much water is in the glaze. So all of this to say is that glazes are not as straightforward as we might like them to be. Like, I'm not a painter. There might be a lot of chemistry going on with paint, but like I have painted canvases before, and I know like if I want red on the canvas, I dip my paintbrush in the red paint and put it on the canvas, and then I kind of get what I was expecting to get. It's not like that with glazes at all. So you might dip your pots into a glaze that seems very thin in the bucket, but you're actually getting a very thick glaze application layer, and then your pots come out of the kiln and your glaze has run. So so there are ways of assessing your glaze and figuring out how much water to add to your glaze, and then adjusting the viscosity. So this word flocculation, that has to do with the chemistry of the clay particles and how they react with the water in the glaze bucket. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of glaze bucket chemistry. And if you're totally confused, don't worry. Like this is why I teach a course on this, because it's a very big topic. It's not simple enough to just kind of write a blog post and then everyone is set. Like, I have a blog where I have written tons of articles. I have a free PDF that will teach you how to measure specific gravity of your glazes that you would be welcome to download and get started with. But there's just so much going on in the glaze bucket that is affecting the way the glaze applies to your pots, and then how they turn out at the end of the firing. So that's glaze bucket chemistry. And And then we've got kiln chemistry, which is like once we get the glazes onto our pots and we put them in the kiln, then the temperature goes up, the glazes melt. A glaze recipe is designed to melt at a certain temperature. The proportions of all these raw materials that we have in our glaze recipes determine whether the glaze will be matte or glossy, whether it'll melt at cone 6 or cone 10 or cone 04, whether the glaze will have like streaks or crystals growing in it. The colors, because we add colorants to our glazes, but the chemistry of the glaze recipe will determine what the color is going to be. So there's all this chemistry that happens inside the kiln. And that's an even bigger subject, bigger topic than glaze bucket chemistry. So these are kind of like the 3 paths you can take. So you can start mixing your own glazes from scratch. I didn't really talk about that, but basically if you've never done it before, that's where you get a recipe. And so it'll be broken down into percentages of like feldspar. We always have clay in our glaze. Silica is our primary glass former. Silica is the material that melts and turns into a glassy surface that gives our pots durability. It makes them sanitary, so they're easy to wash. And then the glass is what holds the color, and you get all these different surface effects. So you can take a recipe where you weigh out all the materials in very specific proportions, add them to the bucket with the water, mix them together. And that's how you mix your own glazes from scratch. So there's all these different like avenues that you can take when you start to, when you get past the point of learning how to glaze, then you want to get good at glazing. And to get really good, like to really master the art of glazing, the glazing process, you really need to understand all of these underlying things, all these other things that are happening. And when you have all of that foundation of knowledge of, what's happening in the glaze bucket, what's happening in the kiln, then you just get better at glazing. You get better at predicting your results. And understanding how different glazes interact with each other, how to layer glazes, like some glazes will layer on top of each other in a nicer way than other glazes. So there's just like so much that goes into what you get on the other side of a firing. So I'm going to talk about the most linear path to take. So you're a new potter, you're using glazes that someone's made for you. Where's my mouse here? Okay. And then, so this is like the most linear path to take is then you learn how to mix your own glazes from scratch, where you can create, you're no longer using glazes that you buy from the store. It's a lot cheaper, like per bucket of glaze, to mix your own from scratch, because when you buy commercial glazes, you're paying for someone else to make them. And when you buy raw materials and put them together yourself, it can be a lot cheaper. But then, of course, you need somewhere to store all of those materials, and you need some glaze mixing equipment. But it's fairly straightforward if you have the space and you have your own studio to do that. And when you learn to mix your glazes from scratch, and what I first learned, so when I was in second year of art school, we first learned to mix glaze from scratch. So the steps for how to weigh the materials and add them to the bucket and add water. And then we learned how to take any glaze and change the color of the glaze. And so that's kind of the first step to glaze testing, where you're starting to change your recipes and maybe make them a little bit your own, so that you're not just using the same recipe that everyone else is using. You can just take a recipe and maybe it has 2% cobalt. Well, you could test it with 1% cobalt, just to change. Cobalt usually makes blue. So if you have 2% and you reduce it to 1%, you would maybe get like a paler blue or a less intense blue color. So it's really easy to kind of mix and match your colors and you could do a lot of testing just by changing the colorants in your glazes. And that's kind of the first step where you can start creating your own glaze recipes. You're not changing the base recipe, so the base glaze stays the same, but you can then have a green version and a blue version and turquoise and yellow and all these different colors of the same base glaze. And when you're using the same base glaze, like on the insides and the outsides of your pots, they're going to be very compatible with each other. So you start out, you learn to mix your own glazes from scratch. Then inevitably you're like, how much water do I add to the bucket? And it's if it was easy to just say, okay, yeah, you just add 75% water. So you have like 100 grams of dry glaze material, you add 75 grams of water, and that's all you need, and every glaze is the same, then you wouldn't need to understand any of this here. But every base glaze is going to react differently with the water. And so then you need to learn a little bit of glaze bucket chemistry in order to really fine tune your application and to get consistent results. Because if you're not measuring the amount of water, you're not measuring specific gravity, every time you go to glaze your pots with the same glaze, you could potentially be getting very different results. And I did this for years. Like I didn't learn about glaze bucket chemistry until about, I don't know, 2018 probably. And so like I graduated from art school in 2010. And so for about 8 years, I learned the chemistry. I'm gonna show you my path, the path that I took in a second. But I learned the chemistry in the kiln before I learned like the glaze bucket chemistry. And so I think if I were to go back and do it differently, this is the order that I would do it. I would learn to mix my glazes, learn to change the colors of my glazes. Then I would learn about the water and flocculation, viscosity, so that I could get more consistent glaze results with the glazes, with the recipes that I'm already using. And then I would start learning about the chemistry of like how to create your own glaze recipes, what the proportions, like why a recipe has 40% NEFSI and 10% whiting and 12% EPK, like why the recipe is in those proportions. That's kind of the most complicated part, although it's not super complicated when you break it down, like when you start from scratch. And that's how I teach. I teach in a very methodical, very like, here's the first step, here's the second step, and I can get you from where you are now to understanding all of this very like seemingly complicated stuff. So this is kind of, if you're just starting out, this is the path that I would take. Now, let's look at, this is the path that I took. So I was just mentioning how I started out, I learned to mix my own glazes from scratch. Then I learned all about the chemistry of glazes. So I took some classes through Alfred University and learned all about the UMF, which is the Unity Molecular Formula, which is just like breaking a glaze recipe down into the oxides, like how much silica and how much alumina and the fluxes versus the glass formers. And so I learned all of that. And then I realized like there was this missing piece of glaze bucket chemistry. And I learned about this because of my role as the studio technician, because I was in charge of managing these 20 large garbage can size buckets of glaze for the studio. And it was just like, it was a bit chaotic. And I really wanted to create a process that my volunteers could follow because we had a rule, nobody could add water to the glazes except for the technicians. And I just wanted like to create a process that took the subjective, like, do I think it's too thin or too thick? Do I think it needs more water? I'm going to stick my finger in and check. And that's like how I used to decide if a glaze needed more water, was just sticking my finger in the bucket. But then every person who goes to use a glaze is going to have a different definition of whether the glaze is too thin or too thick. So that's when I started learning about specific gravity and flocculation and all of that. So here's another path that you could take. It's actually not required that you mix your, I don't know if you can see my mouse. There we go. That you mix your own glazes from scratch before you start learning the glaze bucket chemistry. So you could definitely go from using commercial glazes to understanding the water content and the viscosity of your commercial glazes. You don't need to know the recipe. It is helpful to know the recipe once you start learning kind of about the clay particles and how they work together, but you can learn all of this stuff without actually knowing what's in your glaze, because measuring specific gravity like doesn't require that you know what's in the glaze. All it is taking you're weighing a volume of glaze on a scale and dividing the grams by the milliliters, and that gives you the density of your liquid glaze, which is equivalent to the specific gravity. And that can tell you, whether your glaze could use more water. If your specific gravity is high, then you can add water to bring it down. If your specific gravity is very low, it means you added a little too much water. And then you can solve a lot of glaze problems, and you can start to get very consistent glaze application. So you can create a process for glazing your pots with your particular glazes by understanding specific gravity and viscosity without knowing what's in the glaze recipe that you're using. And as long as you're as long as you're the one that's controlling the water content of your glazes. So if you work in a studio like where I used to work, where you're not allowed to add water to your glazes, then I definitely don't recommend going in and starting to measure specific gravity and altering all the studio glazes. But if you're in control of the water content of the glazes that you're using, then understanding specific gravity and viscosity is going to be very beneficial to your glazing process, and to understanding how to get the results, how to repeat the results that you like. When you unload the kiln and you're like, finally, my glaze is worked out, you can go back, take a specific gravity reading of your glaze, and then the next time you go to glaze, you can just make sure your glaze has the same exact amount of water. And then as long as your application method is consistent, so you're like holding your pots in for the same number of seconds and all of that, then your results are more likely to be consistent. The only caution is if you're using commercial brushing glazes that come in small jars. They often have something added to them to make them more brushable. And so they're not like adjusting the water, measuring specific gravity of those types of glazes. I don't have any experience with them. And so I don't recommend, like, you can definitely do some tests and try, but I don't recommend taking what I teach in my course, Mastering Glaze Consistency, using that course just for commercial brushing glazes, because there's an added component that makes them brushable that kind of changes the chemistry and might change how the flocculants and deflocculants work. So that's the only kind of caveat to like going forth on this path without with using commercial brushing glazes. So you could start by learning specific gravity and viscosity, and then once you're like, oh, I love this, I love having the control, then you might go and mix your own glazes from scratch. You definitely need to understand how to mix your own glazes from scratch before you dive into the chemistry of the glaze. So, this is another path you could take. You could do the glaze bucket chemistry, then you could learn to mix your glazes from scratch, and then you could learn all of the kiln chemistry afterwards. Okay. So here's what it often feels like. It's never a linear path. We learn one thing and we go forth and we think, we get really confident. And then all of a sudden we like try a new glaze or change our temperature or try a different clay body. Even the clay body that you use can really have an effect on how your glazes turn out. Or you fire in a different kiln or something, and then it's like, oh, back to the drawing board, and you go back and relearn all of this stuff. And this is like how it's felt for me. It's like, okay, I understand this, I need to learn a little bit more about that. Oh, actually, now some of the kiln chemistry is actually affecting the glaze bucket chemistry. And so we kind of like go back and forth, and the glaze journey, we never get to the end. There, in anyone's lifetime, you could never ever learn everything that there is to understand about ceramic glazes, which is why I love it so much. I tend to get bored with things once I master them. Like if I were to, take like, I don't know, like learn some skill that once you master the skill, then you just repeat it over and over and you always get an expected result. I would just move on to something else. Whereas with ceramics, the reason why I've been doing this for 15 years now is because I'm always learning and I love learning so much. Like I just love not knowing everything, because then there's still like the magic and the wonder and like the awe of opening the kiln, not really knowing what to expect, but getting better like every time as the years go by. I just get better and better at understanding. And then I do more experiments where I kind of go back to being a beginner again because I'm exploring materials that I haven't studied before. And then I like get to know that aspect of glazes. And then I like, ooh, what's this over here? I want to test, like, there's all these special effect glazes like crystalline glazes and lichen glazes and crater glazes and gloopy glazes. Like there's all these different things that you can do when you understand the chemistry, especially because you can design tests that will teach you how your materials work. So you don't have to have someone teach you everything. You need someone to teach you what to test and how to analyze your results and continue testing so that you can just kind of figure things out, discover new things that you can then share. Hopefully, I really appreciate when people share like their experiments that they're doing, and just in the name of like the collective ceramic knowledge, like lifting that up. The more we learn and share, the more we just understand, like internationally, and then we can use that information to figure more things out. So, so here's how my courses fit in to this whole glaze journey. So I have glaze mixing essentials, which will teach you to mix your own glazes from scratch, and then how to take a base glaze and test it with multiple colorants. And so that is where you get started with glaze testing. You'll make a bunch of test tiles, and just play around with the colors of your glazes. So you'll mix your own glazes. You won't make your own recipes. You'll just use the recipes that are out there, but then you can change the colors of them, and then those become like your own special versions of that glaze. Mastering glaze consistency is where is all about the glaze bucket chemistry. So where I teach you not only like how to measure specific gravity is very simple. I just explained it. You weigh a volume of glaze, you divide the grams by the milliliters, and that is your specific gravity. The complicated part is understanding like what the best specific gravity is for your particular glaze, and then understanding how viscosity and flocculation also affect your glaze's application thickness, which affects the way your glaze is going to appear after the firing. This course will teach you a step-by-step process for figuring all of that out, and then you'll have a repeatable process for each of your individual glazes so that you can start having more consistent glaze results. And then the art of glaze chemistry is where we talk about all the chemistry that's happening in the kiln. I teach you about the unity molecular formula, how to create how to develop your own glazes from scratch, like develop your own glaze recipes. And so if you want to make a matte glaze or a glossy glaze or a satin glaze, you want a glaze that breaks over texture, or a glaze that has like one really thick drip. It doesn't run everywhere. It just drips very slowly. Understanding thermal expansion and crazing, like if you have glazes that craze, how to adjust your recipe so that your glaze fits your clay body a little bit better. Durability, so how to create glazes that are going to withstand the test of time and acids and bases and all of the things that could potentially break down a glaze over time. All of that is what I teach in the art of glaze chemistry. Now, someone at the beginning mentioned my What Do the Glaze Materials Do workshop, which I didn't include in this presentation, but that would go right here. That's basically an intro to the art of glaze chemistry, where it's just an overview of what, all the common materials. Like I live in Canada, so common for North Americans, but a lot of the materials are the same around the world. They might just have different names. But it's just, I go through all the common materials and explain like, okay, this nephsi is a flux. It's a source of primary flux. Whiting is a source of secondary flux. I go through all the materials and explain their role in the glaze recipe. So you can just, when you're looking at a recipe, you can know like, what's dolomite? Dolomite is a secondary flux. It's a source of calcium and magnesium. But it just doesn't go into like how like the proportions of all of these things kind of go together to affect the chemistry, the surface, and all of that. So those are the 3 courses. Now back to those paths that I showed you earlier. So this was the most linear path that I described in the beginning, where you would take glaze mixing essentials, and then mastering glaze consistency, and then the art of glaze chemistry. If I was taking my own courses, this is the path that I essentially took. I learned this skill, and then the art, the glaze chemistry in the kiln, and then I learned the glaze bucket chemistry. But if you're not ready to mix your own glazes from scratch yet, you could definitely still take mastering glaze consistency before you learn to mix glazes from scratch. But you definitely always need to you need to know how to mix glazes from scratch before you take the art of glaze chemistry. Now, you don't have to have learned that from me. You could have learned that anywhere, but you just need to have the skill of glaze mixing before you take this program. So just like a few little screenshots of so this is glaze mixing essentials. So these are all the glaze materials that I store in these plastic containers, and then we weigh them on a scale, add them to the bucket. And here's an example of a glaze recipe and me like checking off all the materials as I add them to the bucket. And then you get into colorant testing. So you mix a big base glaze, and then you divide it into all these containers, and then you add a different colorant to each one. I did my test on 4 different clay bodies, and then you end up with this like rainbow of glaze colors, all with the same base glaze. So Glaze Mixing Essentials is currently open for registration. I opened it up earlier this year, and it's just open ongoing. So you can sign up for this class at any time. The price is $197 US. And so it's an independent self-study course, meaning that you sign up and you can just take it by yourself. There's no like live component to the course. Talk a little bit about getting support in a second. Then mastering glaze consistency is where we get into measuring. So this is how I measure specific gravity using a graduated cylinder. I talk about the importance of mixing your glaze really well. We talk about viscosity. So when your glaze is really thin, that means you have low viscosity, and then thicker glaze has high viscosity. And these are examples of test tiles of the same glaze, but just different water content levels or different viscosities. You can get very different results. Like for example, this glaze, when it's thick, it's very purple, pinky purple in color, but where it's thin, you get more yellow. And so being able to control which result you get is very important, to predicting, like if you're glazing a piece and you want it to be this color, you want to make sure that it's not going to be yellow, because then you might be disappointed. Some glazes are very drastic. This is our sapphire blue glaze. This has minimal water content, so a high specific gravity. And then this is where I added more water to lower the specific gravity. All of a sudden, the glaze is too thin to give a very good application layer. And then this glaze, this is where I flocculated this glaze. So I didn't adjust the water content, but I flocculated the glaze to increase the viscosity in the bucket while keeping the water the same. And then I get my blue back. And then this is just like a glaze that kind of runs when it's too thick, and then it's kind of more pale blue when it's on the thinner side. So mastering glaze consistency is the course that's open for registration right now, this week only. So registration is open until Saturday at 5 p.m. Pacific time. If you sign up by midnight Pacific time today, you can take advantage of my early bird pricing. So today it's $297 US, and the price tomorrow is going up to $347. So you could save $50 by signing up today if that's something you're interested in. And you get lifetime access to all of these programs. So that's just something to keep in mind, that because I know that the glaze journey is like this crazy path where you learn something and then you have to go back and learn it again once you get more knowledge. I really want my students to have the ability to go back and re-watch the course as often as they need to, depending on where you are on the journey. Now, Mastering Glaze Consistency is a guided program, meaning that the modules are dripped out over the month of February. So you don't get the whole course at once. I've kind of spaced it out so that you can, watch some lessons and then take a little bit of time to absorb what you've learned before like rushing through to the next lesson. And so this course, the live guided version of this course, takes place over the month of February. We have a Zoom call every Thursday, starting next week. So not tomorrow, but starting next Thursday. And there's a private student Facebook group, so you can be asking questions throughout the week. And then we get together once a week for a live Zoom call where we can chat face to face. You can talk about the glazes that you're working with, and then I can help you with any specific issues that you're encountering. And then the Art of Glaze Chemistry is where we talk about the periodic table of elements. I explain which elements are used the most in ceramics and in our glazes, and the role that all of these elements play. This is a scanning electron microscope image of a matte glaze that was designed to be a matte glaze based on the chemistry of the glaze. So some matte glazes are actually under fired glossy glazes, meaning that, when we glaze our pots, the glaze starts out as a liquid and then the water evaporates and the glaze dries. We have all these solid particles on our pots. Then they go into the kiln and those solid particles start to melt. Well, if they haven't completely melted at the time that the kiln shuts off, they just kind of fuse together and you may end up with a matte glaze that's just an underfired glossy glaze. So this is a scanning electron microscope image of a properly formed matte glaze, which is the glaze has completely melted into a liquid. And then during the cooling cycle, crystals grow within the liquid and in the glass, and that's what turns the glaze into a matte glaze. This image here is an underfired matte glaze, where it's just a bunch of particles that are fused together, and they're very vulnerable to to break down. Like they haven't formed this really strong, durable surface yet. And so if your matte glazes are underfired, they're more susceptible to leach, to break down over time. Going in the dishwasher with hot soapy water, that can be very that can really speed up the process of breaking down a glaze that isn't durable and has not properly formed a glass yet. And you may have seen this chart before. If any of you use glazy.org, this chart is on there. This is my version of the chart, but this is where we can plot the chemistry of our glazes, and it kind of shows us where our glaze is likely to be matte. So in the green section, we would get matte glazes. The red section is glossy glazes. The blue section is underfired, and we can kind of predict based on a recipe whether the glaze is likely to be matte or glossy. And so that's really fun to play around with once you understand the chemistry. And this is just an example of the UMF of a glaze, where you enter in glazy.org, you can enter a glaze recipe, which is written in material percentages, and it takes the recipe and it breaks it down into its various components. The elements: sodium, potassium, calcium, these are the fluxes. Alumina, silica, boron, those are the glass formers. And based on the proportions of all of these elements to each other, you can predict a lot of things, like the temperature the glaze might melt at, matte and glossy, durability, all of that. So here's an example of some, tests. We really we take the colorant testing from Glaze Mixing Essentials to a whole new level in the art of glaze chemistry, because we then we test colorants with different fluxes, because the flux choice in your base recipe, so if your glaze is fluxed with calcium versus magnesium, your colorants are going to turn out different colors. And so this is an example of one of the assignments that you get. And then this is an example. All of these white glazes are just like one base glaze with different silica and alumina levels, plotted on the Stull chart, where we've got glossy glazes in the middle, matte glazes on the left, and underfired down here. And so there's lots of glaze testing in the art of glaze chemistry. This is an example of crazing. So we do talk about thermal expansion, how to reduce crazing, how to get your glazes to fit your clay bodies a little bit better. So the art of glaze chemistry, registration doesn't open until March. But for those of you who are interested in it, It runs over the months of April and May. So it's a 9-week program. We take a little week off in the middle. And we have a Zoom call every week. There's a private Facebook group, and you get lifetime access to join or to that program as well. And that's another one. You know, it's very like this is a lifelong learning, understanding the art of glaze chemistry. It's never one and done. You learn and then you go back and you learn again, go back and you learn again. And you just, when you accept that, then the learning, you know, you're not in a hurry to get to a result. You can enjoy the process a little bit more. You can be fascinated by your disappointing glaze results. You can just use chemistry to understand what happened and then what to try next. So it's all an experiment. And then on top of all of these programs, I have, it's fairly new. I just started this, the Glaze Lab membership. I started last summer. And so if you join any of these programs, you will be invited to join the Glaze Lab membership, which includes a community where you can post questions and have discussions. There's monthly studio challenges and experiments of the month. So in December, we tested gold glazes, and then January was floating blue. In February, we're going to be testing crawl or lichen glazes. So I designed an experiment. I designed it in such a way that whether you've only taken this program or you've taken all of them, that there's something for everybody, regardless of your experience level. And so we're just exploring glazes together as a group. And then you also get access to other workshops like my What Do the Glaze Materials Do workshop that I was talking about earlier. That's inside the Glaze Lab. And there's some behind the scenes videos of me in my studio where I just I'm recycling clay. I fired my new kiln for the first time and took a bunch of video about how I programmed it and everything. I haven't actually posted those videos yet, but that's coming. But when I'm in my studio working on things, I'll share a lot of that with the Glaze Lab members, and that is $29 US dollars a month. And you can only join that if you sign up for one of these programs, and then you get an invitation. So there's supposed to be a way for me to post buttons on the screen, but here's the URL. I might do that in a second, where you can, it has a link to all of these classes if you're interested. And then I'm going to turn my PowerPoint off and I'm going to get into answering all your questions. And I am happy to share my screen and all of that, and show you around and explain things a little bit further. So I'm trying to figure out how to stop. Okay, I'm back. So I am just going to organize my screens a little bit here, and coming back to answer your questions. So here are the buttons. I'm just gonna post the button for mastering glaze consistency, because this is the class where if you sign up today, you can take advantage of the early bird discount, and registration closes on Saturday. So this one's kind of the one that has a time limit. So there is there's the button to go straight to the mastering glaze consistency page, if you're interested in. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water. Thank you all for watching my presentation. And then I'm gonna answer some questions. So I know there's a lot of chat. I'm just gonna start with the questions that Laura's been copying questions over to a shared document for me. So I'm gonna focus on those and then I'll get back into the chat. Okay, so Judy asks, I would love to learn more about what the glaze material reactions are and what they do. So it depends what you mean. If you mean in the bucket, usually that means in the kiln. And so the material reactions, like when we put our glazed pots into the kiln, and the temperature goes up, then depending on the proportions of the materials in the glazes, certain reactions take place. Our materials start melting, and then other materials start melting. And then once everything is in a liquid state, the molecules start interacting with each other. That's where you get different surface qualities, matte versus glossy. And so if that's what you mean, the glaze material reactions and what they do. So that would be taught in the Art of Glaze Chemistry program. Now, in the bucket, so our liquid glazes in the bucket, there are reactions taking place based on a concept called flocculation. And so when we mix our glaze materials with water, it's the clay particles in the glaze recipe that are they're not the only ones that are kind of reacting, but they kind of determine the viscosity of the glaze. And so a glaze that is in a flocculated state, for example, or a glaze that you have flocculated. So saturated Epsom salt solution, you may have heard of it, is what I use to flocculate my glazes. So if I take a glaze in the bucket and I determine that it needs to be flocculated because I've measured specific gravity, I've got the water content where I want it, and then the glaze has a very low, like it might seem like it has way too much water in it. I could add a saturated Epsom salt solution to the glaze, which is going to cause a reaction in the bucket where the clay particles are going to attract each other like magnets. So they're going to go from like just floating around the bucket, they're going to find each other and stick together. And because the clay particles are sticking together, it creates more resistance in the bucket, and that increases the viscosity of the glaze. And that also increases the thickness of your glaze application. So if you were to take a test tile and dip it into an unflocculated glaze for 6 seconds, let's say, and then dip it into a flocculated glaze for 6 seconds, the flocculated glaze is going to give you a thicker application, and then your results are going to come out of the kiln looking very different. The thicker glaze might run, or the thinner glaze might be too thin where like you can kind of feel the clay body through. Your glaze might not have a decent enough layer of glass to make it nice and smooth. And so those are kind of what I mean by reactions in the glaze bucket. Okay, Januk says, which college institute you took glaze training? So first I went to Kootenai School of the Arts in Nelson, BC. So I took a 2-year program. And then I took 3 online courses through Alfred University. That's in upstate New York. So they were online. I didn't go to New York State to take them, but it was through Alfred University. Janet says, mixing glazes for spray glazing application. Yeah, so if you spray your glazes, you can determine the best water content for spraying application. So whether you're brushing or dipping or spraying, your glaze is going to need to have a different kind of consistency in the bucket to give you the best results. So when you're spraying, you want a glaze that is thin enough, that has a low enough viscosity that it won't clog your spray gun, but you also don't want it to have so much water in it that when you're spraying, your pots just get soaking wet before you get a decent layer of glaze on your pots. So you can use mastering glaze consistency to determine the best specific gravity. Generally, I would keep the specific gravity higher for spraying, as high as I can without clogging the gun. So you don't want it so thick that it's like can't pass through the gun, the spray gun. But then you don't want so much water that you're just spraying a whole bunch of water and then your glaze starts dripping, because the bisque becomes saturated with water before you get a decent layer of glaze. And so you can definitely use mastering glaze consistency for any application method. And I talk about dipping and brushing and spraying. I generally dip my glazes, but I did spray when I was in school, and then at the rec center, I would teach people how to use the spray booth. So I do have a lot of experience with spraying. I just don't have, I have a air compressor and a spray gun and everything. It's just, I just don't have a spray booth set up at my home studio right now. Dave, can you give a brief description of each of the 7 modules in Mastering Glaze Consistency course? Yes, I can. So let me see here. I actually have that right here. Let me share my screen with you guys. Share your screen. Okay. Mastering glaze consistency. Share. Okay. So here are the 7 modules of mastering glaze consistency. This is on the page that the button that I posted the button for. You can, let's see, there's little links everywhere. So if you hit curriculum, it'll take you right to this part of the page. So module 1, setting yourself up for success. That's where you're going to be making test tiles and you're going to be gathering supplies. So I tell you all the tools. Basically, you need a graduated cylinder and a scale. You could use a syringe. I teach with a graduated cylinder because that's what I use, but you can also use a syringe to measure specific gravity. Flocculants, so saturated Epsom salts. Deflocculants, I use Darvan for a deflocculant, but Dispex and Dolopix are other deflocculants that are available in other parts of the world if you're not in North America. So first module is making test tiles, gathering supplies. Module 2 is where I talk about why glazes are so inconsistent. We talk about kiln temperature, cooling cycle, bisque porosity. So the temperature that you fire your bisque to is going to impact your application thickness. I talk about specific gravity and viscosity and flocculation, just how all of that affects your glaze results, and why, I talk about how you need to mix your glazes really well in order to get consistent results. So I talk about all the reasons why it's such a struggle. Let me turn this. It's such a struggle to get the same results from firing to firing. So I talk about all the factors that you need to pay attention to when you're glazing and firing your kilns, in order to have more consistent outcomes. Then module 3, I go into all the science behind water content and specific gravity. I talk about density, and I talk about why using a hydrometer isn't an accurate way of measuring specific gravity. So everything to do with the science of water content and specific gravity. Module 4, I talk about the science behind glaze viscosity in the bucket and flocculation. So I talk about the clay particles and how they attract each other or repel each other, and how that affects your application thickness, which affects your fired glaze results. So modules 2 to 4 is all of the information that you get, the knowledge that you need to do all of the testing, that comes in modules 5 and 6. So module 5 is where we start measuring and adjusting our specific gravity, and where you'll do a series of tests where you take one glaze, you mix it up with a very high specific gravity, so minimal water content, and then you dip a test tile, add a bit more water, and you gradually lower your specific gravity to very low, like lower than would be ideal. And then you get this range of test tiles that shows you the potential for your glaze. So you can see how your glaze is going to look when it's too thin, how it's going to look when it's too thick. And then you'll find like, oh, this is how I want it to look. And you'll know exactly how much water content you need in that particular glaze in order to get it to look that way. Then module 6 is where we start testing altering the viscosity of our glazes, because it's not just about the water content. We have to take viscosity into consideration. Some glazes are going to need to be flocculated based on what they're made of. Some glazes are going to need to be deflocculated. Some glazes aren't going to need to be flocculated or deflocculated. And so I teach you how to decide and what like the best, how to get the result that you're looking for with the best water content and the best viscosity for each of your particular glazes. And then module 7 is improving glaze results. I wasn't sure if I had all the lessons here, but basically module 7 is where I go, each lesson is on a specific problem. So if your glaze is crawling, here's how to use specific gravity and viscosity to solve your crawling glaze. If your glaze is running, if you're, if you're having very thin rims, sometimes you'll glaze your pots and the rims will be very thin, and scratchy. So the glaze looks fine, but then the rims of your mugs might not have much glaze on them. So I talk about that. So I talk about all the different problems that specific gravity and viscosity can solve. And so this is kind of like a wrap up of like, okay, you can come back. So if in the future you're like, oh, my glaze is crawling, and crawling means where your glaze pulls away and exposes the clay body underneath. So you might get like patches of your piece where the glaze is missing. That's called crawling. And so then you can go back to this specific lesson and I give you the steps for, okay, this is what you want to pay attention to with your specific gravity and then your viscosity, and here's how to solve that problem. So those are all the modules for mastering glaze consistency. So when you register, you get access to module 1 immediately. So if you sign up today, you can get started today making test tiles and gathering your supplies. And then on Sunday, you get access to modules 2, 3, and 4. And that is the learning phase. I call it the learning phase, where you get this foundation of knowledge before we get into actually going into our studios and doing all that testing that I was talking about. And then the next week you get 5 and 6. Then we have a break. We still have a Zoom call, but it's just you don't get another module. So you can kind of take your time with modules 5 and 6 over those 2 weeks. And then the final week 4, you get access to module 7. Okay. Jamie says, do I have to be actively mixing my own glazes to take mastering glaze consistency? I have control over one glaze, my Olica, and all of my Mason Stain colorants, but I have access, but not control of 20 glaze buckets. I'm sure you'd be able to test them and offer feedback. Yeah, so you don't need to be mixing your own glazes for mastering glaze consistency. So you can do all of the steps. You can do all the testing in where you I give you instructions for if you aren't mixing your own glaze from scratch, or if you're starting with an existing glaze in a bucket, you're going to pull out a small sample. So if you have a large bucket, you're just going to test with a small sample. So you're not messing with your whole bucket of glaze. And then you're going to remove as much water as you can, let it settle out just to raise the specific gravity. And then you'll kind of test and add the water back in and test your way back down. And so as long as it's not those small jars of commercial brushing glazes, then yes, you can definitely use Mastering Glaze Consistency to take with your glazes that you don't mix yourself. So let me know if I answered your question, but I think, yeah, you should have no problem. And so then you can, with your Maiolica glaze, you can test it with different glaze thicknesses, and then you can also test with your mason stains over top. And however, whatever your glazing process is on your test tiles, so you can see like, oh, okay, this is the best thickness of my base glaze that when I apply the colors on top, that, you know, it looks the best. And so I think that would work out great for that. And so I don't know if you're saying that about the 20 glaze buckets, if that was referring to me being in control of 20 glaze buckets, or if you work in a studio where there's 20 glaze buckets. But if you get this knowledge, you're free to use this knowledge in a studio that you have access to, or like you can't share the course with another person, but once the knowledge is yours, you're free to teach others, of course, and pass your knowledge along. And then you could, if you are working in a public studio, you could the studio could benefit from you understanding this process. Danielle, I am doing non-functional ceramics and fire at cone 04 or 5. I would like to take the AGC class, but what to learn to use the UMF chart for lower temperature. Would the class help with that? Yeah, so in the art of glaze chemistry, I cover low fire, cone 6, cone 10, all temperatures. And so I teach you how to raise and lower temperatures of your glazes. And then I teach you some guidelines for if you're working at cone 6, like boron is kind of the main ingredient that we would increase or decrease in order to raise and lower melting temperature. And so I teach you for your specific temperature, this is the boron level that you probably want to have if you're working at low fire. And then this is the boron level that's ideal at cone 6 and cone 10. So I definitely cover all the temperatures and give you the knowledge that you would need to switch from one temperature to another. And like you could even fire to cone 8 or cone 1 or whatever, using what you learn about how to adjust melting temperature. Janak says, I'm in India, so how do I pay? Is it possible to pay in 2 or 3 installments? So payment is by credit card, and there is a 3 installment option. So for Mastering Glaze Consistency today, that's open today. I believe it's $135 would be the monthly payments. But if you register today, you get $50 off your first payment. So it would be $85 for your first payment, and then $135 and $135 for 3 months. So it's 3 payments. Yeah, and so yeah, you can. That's definitely an option. Rob, will MGC be offered any other time throughout the year? So this is the only time I will be offering it with the 4 weekly Zoom calls. I do plan on opening registration at some point later in the year, but it's going to be an independent study where you're just buying the course, where you can take the course and watch the lessons independently. And it'll have the option to join the Glaze Lab membership if you want support. And in the Glaze Lab, we do 2 monthly Zoom calls, and then there's a members area for like a community discussion board. And there are sections for each of these courses. So for any students who are like, if you're going through Mastering Glaze Consistency, then there's a place for you to post questions specific to that course in the Glaze Lab membership. But if you like learning independently and learning by yourself, and you don't need the support, you don't want to ask questions, then you could just take the course independently. All of my past students get an invite to the Glaze Lab a couple times a year as well. So that there is that option as well. So I don't know when it will be offered. I'm doing the Art of Glaze Chemistry is opening up at the end of March, and so it might be sometime in the summer when I have a chance to get Mastering Glaze Consistency open for enrollment again, but it will be a self-study at that time. So if you want to take it in a group with students who are going through the course at the same time as you, with a very active Facebook group where everyone's posting their questions and their results, and the weekly Zoom calls, then now would be the best time to sign up for Mastering Glaze Consistency. Okay, so that's the end of the questions that Laura had copied over for me. I'm just looking in the chat, and I'm going to have a sip of water. And I am definitely here to answer any other questions if you have them. Jamie, are the modules asynchronous and the Zoom Q&A the only live sessions? So for Mastering Glaze Consistency, so you get, the modules are released on a schedule. So you get access to module 1 right away. Then you get modules 2 to 4 on Sunday, this Sunday coming. Then the following Sunday, you would get access to modules 5 and 6. Then we have implementation week where you don't get another module, but you have plenty of homework for modules 5 and 6. And then in week 4, you get module 7. So they're released on a schedule. Once you have all of it, then you have lifetime access to everything. And you could, so like, even if February isn't a good month for you, you could sign up by March. By the end of February, you're going to have access to the entire course and you can just go through it at your own pace. But then the weekly Zoom calls are just for the month of February. I think the last one is on March 2nd or something. Mike, can I work at my own schedule in Mastering Glaze Consistency? Yeah, you can definitely work at your own schedule. There's no requirement to join the Zoom calls. There's no requirement to keep up with the program. You could sign up now and take it in May if you want. The Zoom calls, so they're at 10 a.m. Pacific time on Thursdays. But if you can't join live, maybe you live in New Zealand or Australia and you'll be sleeping at that time, you can submit questions in advance. I always go answer the pre-submitted questions at the beginning of the Zoom call, and then the Zoom is recorded. And so then you can go back and watch the replay and get the answers to your questions. So you can still get all your questions answered either in the Facebook group or on the Zoom calls, regardless of whether you can attend the Zooms live. Jamie, I will not have access to my glazes until February 13th, and I'm an active type student. So February 13th, let me just look at my calendar. Okay, so module 5, February 5th, which is this Sunday, you get modules 2 to 4, which there's no studio work involved. All it is information, bit of science and chemistry about understanding why your glazes are inconsistent, and then understanding specific gravity, glaze density, clay particles, viscosity, flocculation, all of that. So there's no homework except for just like, there's some questions like post in the Facebook group where you might like be looking at your glazes or just like thinking about the results that you've been getting. And you can post any issues that you've had with your glazes that you kind of want to work through in this class. And then on February the 12th is when the glaze testing begins. So if you have access to your glazes starting on February 13th, that's perfect timing. So you can still watch, you can still stay up with the course content. And then on February 13th, you can start your glaze testing. And that should be perfect if you, as long as you have test tiles. So you'll need to be dipping test tiles, or at least like a chunk of clay, a chunk of bisque fired clay. Ideally, you would have test tiles for dipping into your glazes during the experiments. And then you have from basically February 13th to the last Zoom call is on March 2nd. So you have all that time to get your glaze testing done, your kiln fired, and then you can post your results to the community and ask questions, and you can join the Zoom calls, or I can answer your questions on the Zoom call. And so hopefully that would work for your schedule. Janak, hopefully I'm saying your name correctly, maybe I'm not. Glaze chemistry course. Before we start, do we know what all materials have to keep ready? So basically for the glaze chemistry course, if you're already mixing your own glazes from scratch, whatever materials you already have, you can use for that course. And so I'm going to teach you, you might want to buy, like when you learn about all the different fluxes, you might want to buy some other materials that you don't have because you want to test them and see how the colorants turn out with like zinc or dolomite or something. But you can basically work with the materials that you already have. You definitely will need, so for mastering glaze consistency, you need at least a dozen test tiles per glaze that you want to test per clay body. So if you have 3 glazes that you really want to understand, you would need like 12 test tiles times 3 is 36. For the art of glaze chemistry, you need at least 50 test tiles. I always recommend making way more test tiles than you need. 50 test tiles in every clay body that you use. More is always better. So let me know, like oxides. Yeah, like you can definitely work the art of glaze chemistry course. You can work with whatever you have available. You don't need to go out and buy everything. You're going to get the knowledge to know what materials you might want to purchase in the future, but you can do the course with what you have. Is there a list of the raw ingredients and supplies needed for the course? Which course? There is a mostly for mastering glaze consistency. You get that as soon as you sign up, but I think I have a post coming out this week with the supply list. Let's see if I can find it. But basically the supply list, oh, here, course supplies checklist. I'll just share it with you quickly because it is on the sales page. Okay, how do I share my screen again? Okay, so this is on the Mastering Glaze Consistency info page. So if that's the course you are talking about, here's the course supplies. So you need a calculator, a scooping device, so just like something to get your glaze from the bucket into your graduated cylinder. You need witness cones. I recommend everyone has witness cones. I understand that they're not available everywhere in the world, but if you are looking to master glaze consistency, you're going to need to be putting witness cones in your glaze firings. You need a scale for weighing your glaze, a scale that measures grams. It doesn't need to be 1/10 of a gram or 100th of a gram, just a scale that measures grams. You need a graduated cylinder or a syringe or some sort of accurate volume measuring device. So you can't use like a measuring cup that has like hello, are we here? I don't know what happened. My screen went black and I see all of you saying your screen went black. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Technology, my goodness. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I was waiting for something to go wrong. Okay, so we got that out of the way. Technical difficulties. Anyways, for mastering glaze consistency, you basically need the glazes that you're working with, and then a scale and a volume measuring container, and then flocculants and deflocculants. So, and I explain everything in detail in the course in module 1, right when you sign up. So there's a lesson on every piece of equipment that you need to get. And then I talk about the test tiles that you need. Having a glaze journal is very important if you're trying to master glaze consistency. So I don't know when it cut out, but I was talking about scales and graduated cylinders. So please let me know if I didn't if that was what you were trying to understand. And okay, great. And so now I've lost the chat. I've lost all your previous comments. Let me see. So if you have any other questions, yeah, feel free to repost them in the chat because the chat has refreshed. So sorry about that. Okay, Jamie, do you have specifications for the test tiles? No, I offer lots of different ways that you can make test tiles. So, you know, I just bought an extruder this year, but all this time I've never had an extruder. So, as Jamie says, I throw it, you can throw a cylinder on the wheel and then cut it up and make test tiles that way. That's totally fine. You can roll a slab and cut out rectangles. You could just like squish, you could just take balls of clay and squish. I recommend that your test tiles represent your pots in some sort of way. So if you put a lot of texture on your pots, like say you make your pots by rolling slabs and then you put texture on your slabs, I recommend that you do that for your test tiles as well, because we're trying to create the best conditions for your glaze on your clay body that are going to work, you know, for the way that you make your pots. So if you have texture on your test tiles, you're going to be able to see how that glaze looks over texture, whether it breaks over texture or if it covers the texture up. And if that's something that you're trying to solve for, it's really good if your test tiles kind of match your pots in some way. If you make tiles and you fire them flat, then you can also make test tiles and fire them flat. If you mostly make pots where your glazes are going to be on a vertical surface, then I definitely recommend making test tiles that stand up in some way and have a vertical surface so you can see how the glaze flows, whether it's going to run. Because glazes can look very different if they're flat, if they're fired horizontally, or if they're fired vertically. Lost my words. So, yeah. So no specifications for test tiles, just however you can make them. And then just like if they can resemble your pots in some way, if you apply slip to your pots, like colored slips, I would maybe have some test tiles that are just the bare clay body and then some that have slip on them. So you can see, you can test like the opacity of your glaze, the transparency of your glaze. If you're trying to work with a clear glaze that goes cloudy, then you definitely want a way of testing for transparency. You could, sometimes I'll just do like a stripe of underglaze on my test tiles so I can kind of see how transparent my glaze is, especially if I'm working with a white clay body. But I talk a lot about test tiles in the course as well. And then I give you links to articles, like I wrote an article, different styles of test tiles you can make for glaze testing. So that, yeah, so that is, that's about test tiles. So there's no, yeah, I wouldn't stress out too much. The idea is you want to have more than you need, and you don't want them to ever be so precious that you're worried about ruining a test tile by dipping it into a glaze that might not turn out very nice. So you have lots of test tiles at your disposal, so you can do lots of testing, because it's very important to get into the habit of testing your glazes before glazing kiln loads full of pots. I like to do a graduated testing process where I start on a small test tile. Then I work my way up to like maybe a small pinch pot or a bowl, and then maybe just like one mug, and then kind of, because the glazes, depending on the size of your piece, the glazes can look very different. The thickness of your piece, a small test tile isn't always a very good representation of how a glaze will look if it had like this large surface to flow and move and everything. So I do teach, to kind of graduate from very simple test tiles to like more like larger forms, so that you're not surprised when your lovely test tile, your glaze doesn't turn out the same on your larger pots. Okay, Rob, what class would discuss most successful methods for layering glazes? What glazes work well together? None of my classes specifically teach you how to test the glazes that you have. So either mastering glaze consistency or the art of glaze chemistry, either of those courses, they really emphasize the importance of testing, and you testing in order to see what happens. Because I have a lot of, I understand chemistry, glaze chemistry, on a level where I could look at a glaze recipe, look at the chemistry. I could predict, roughly what temperature it would fire to, probably if it's going to be matte or glossy, if it would run. I can predict a lot of things, but when we start layering glazes together, there's so many factors that can play a role in how the glaze is going to turn out. So, for example, and mastering glaze consistency, I think, would definitely help with this, because if you're layering, say you have glaze A and glaze B, and you dip your pot in glaze A, and then like 5 minutes later you dip it in glaze B, you could potentially get a very different result than if you dip it in glaze A and then tomorrow you dip it in glaze B, because of bisque porosity, which I teach in mastering glaze consistency. Or if you hold your pot in glaze A for 10 seconds and then you dip it really quickly in glaze B, you're going to get a different result than if you do like a quick dip in glaze A and then a long dip in glaze B. So there's so many factors that are going to contribute to the result that you get. But I think mastering glaze consistency is going to teach you how to how to control, what you need to pay attention to during your glaze layering process, so that if you like the result that you get, so you could test like, okay, I'm going to dip them both for 3 seconds, and then I'm going to do 1 for 3 and 1 for 6, and then 1 for 6 and 1 for 3. You're going to keep track of all of that in your glaze journal. You're going to keep track of the specific gravity, and because that also is going to affect layering. And then you're going to get all these results out of the kiln of all these different options. If you like one of them better than the rest, you're going to have all of the steps that you need to go and repeat that result a second time, or at least come as close as possible. So yeah, to answer your question, like mastering glaze consistency, I think would be the best class for you to use to test your glazes and understand which glazes are going to work well together. Like we would just use the glazes that you already have been using and you're already familiar with. And then you can use what you learn with your glazes to like bring in new glazes. You'll already have a system. So you're like, okay, I saw this other glaze I want to try. And then you're going to know what to test in order to get to the result that you want the fastest. So I think you would get a lot out of both of those courses, but definitely mastering glaze consistency. I think if you didn't have that foundation, even if you took the art of glaze chemistry to learn about like the underlying chemistry of the glaze recipes, you're going to wish you understand a little bit more about water content and application thickness, because that is essentially, recipes aside, the application thickness, the way your bisque absorbs water, like how long your glaze takes to dry, all of these factors come into how your layered glazes are going to show up after the firing. So you don't even need to know the chemistry of the glazes. You just need to have keep very good track of your glazing process so that you can repeat it the next time. If you get really good results, then you'll know what to do next time. Dave asks if I'm going to offer the Art of Glaze Chemistry later this year. Yes, so the Art of Glaze Chemistry will be offered again in September throughout the months. It'll be the end of September, and it'll take place over the months of October and November. So we'll have a spring session and a fall session, and that's kind of how I'm going to go with the Art of Glaze Chemistry. Going forward is every year I'll do a spring session and a fall session. Janet. Oh, Janet from Jerry and Janet Beaumont. Hello, good to see you, or to see your name. Spray glazing, suspension, and flow. I'm not sure that I understand your question. But the Mastering Glaze Consistency course, we talk about, flow. Viscosity is a fluid's resistance to flow. So a big component of mastering glaze consistency is understanding how your glaze flows as a liquid. And then in mastering glaze consistency, you can figure out the best conditions for spraying your glazes. So the best water content, and then whether you want your glaze to be flocculated or deflocculated, that is how you kind of adjust the flow of your glaze. That will determine how fast your glaze takes to dry. And so, yeah, mastering glaze consistency definitely covers flow, all aspects of flow. If you have a more specific question about glazing, suspension, and flow, I would be happy to answer it. Just making sure Rob. So as I understand it, I can order MGC now, but have access to it forever. Yes, that is correct. So now All of my courses, Glaze Mixing Essentials, Mastering Glaze Consistency, and the Art of Glaze Chemistry, you get access to them forever. So you don't have to go on the schedule that I've outlined. Yeah, so you can come back, you can review. I recommend, especially for the Art of Glaze Chemistry and Mastering Glaze, well, all of them, I recommend you take the class once, you do all the steps and the experiments, and then like maybe in a year from now, you go back and review, or even 6 months from now, the next time you have a problem where you're like, this isn't working, I thought I knew this already, you go back and review the course and you have access to it for as long as you need, because you are going to learn more things, you're going to try new things, and you're going to feel like a beginner again at some point. You know, on the glaze journey, you're going to go back and forth with your levels of understanding. You're always building. So you're always building your foundation of knowledge, but it's impossible to just learn everything all at once. And then the experience that you have is going to require you to learn different aspects and really pay attention to certain things. And once you have like a year's worth of experience and you take the course again, you're going to understand things in a whole different way. I am a very, I take all sorts of online courses about other things. Like I started taking, I learned how to do website, like WordPress and websites. I learned how to like build an online course by taking an online course. I learned how to make a membership. So I'm always taking online courses and I'm always going back and rewatching because when I first take the course, I'm like a deer in headlights, like, oh my God, there's so much information. And I'm like super excited. But then once I go into my studio or once I start implementing what I've learned, it's like, okay, I actually need to go back and review. And so the courses are all available for you to review them as often as you like. Janet, yes, you are so smart. Thanks, Janet. Oh, Janet, our glazes gel up in our spray glaze containers after about 15 minutes. Okay, so if your glaze is gelling, a couple things could be happening. It could be so thick that you are spraying more water than glaze particles. Like, so the glaze is so thick that you're not getting like a homogenized mixture of water and glaze particles during your spraying process. And so you may need to add a little bit more water, or you may need to deflocculate your glaze, which is going to make it flow better. And you may need less water. So generally, when I hear a glaze is gelling, the solution is often to deflocculate. And that is something like I would want to first know what the specific gravity is, because that will tell me, oh, it just needs more water or it has too much water. If it's gelling, it probably doesn't have too much water, but it could, depending if it's like 40% Gersley borate or something. But deflocculating a glaze that gels, I talked about the clay particles, like magnets attracting each other. When you deflocculate, the bonds of the clay particles break free and then they can flow. They just flow past one another. They don't stick together, and everything flows very nicely and evenly. And so the answer to your gelling question is probably going to be to either lower the specific gravity or to deflocculate, depending on what you're starting with. We have used V-gum and separate bentonite and it still gels. Maybe you want to try without V-gum or bentonite and see what happens, because I wonder if that is contributing to the gelling. I'd be very curious to see the entire recipe. Specific gravity 1.5. I would try to, if your specific gravity is 1.5, I would try deflocculating a sample Don't do the whole bucket, but pull out a sample and try deflocculating with Darvan. And then, because that should really take care of the gelling and hopefully give you better spraying consistency. Janak, 1:15 a.m. Oh, I so appreciate your dedication. So yes, please go to bed if it's nighttime for you. Thank you all again for joining me here today. I really appreciate you coming to learn more about these glaze courses. Rob, do you discuss firing schedules in MGC? So I discuss the effect of your firing schedule on your fired results. And then in the Facebook group, I have my firing schedule posted, and I'm happy to answer questions about your firing schedule. So I talk about temperature and cooling cycles, and I talk about how glazes react differently to a slow cool versus a fast cool. I just don't tell you what your firing schedule should be because that's up to you to decide. But if you want to post your firing schedule and like a result that you're trying to get or that you're not getting, we can look at your firing schedule and see if any adjustments could be made to the firing schedule in order to improve your results. So we do talk about firing schedules, but I don't teach you how to program your kiln, but those are things that almost always every Zoom call, I'm talking about firing schedules because it's very relevant to consistent glaze results and to solving a lot of problems. So like certain problems can be solved by adjusting your firing schedule, starting with putting witness cones in your firing. And then a lot of people who start using witness cones for the first time realize their kilns are under or over firing. And so then I would help you adjust your firing schedule so that you're going to reach the temperature that you had intended. Dave, do you recommend Darvan 7, 811, or 812? I personally use Darvan 7, which is sodium polymethacrylate. So that's the chemical formula for Darvan 7. But Darvan 811 and 812, I believe one of them is sodium based and one of them might be ammonia or ammonium based. But both of them, I've had other students use them and have successful results. So I only can recommend what I've tried myself, but I do know from other people reporting back to me that Darvan 811 and 812 both work for deflocculating. So no problem there. Whatever you have access to should work just fine. Yeah. Janet. Thanks, Janet. She's singing my praises. I don't know if it's Janet or Jerry or both of you, but you guys are lovely. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are almost at the top of the hour again. So thank you all if you're still here for coming to this open house info session. And so I'm going to let you all go now. But if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email me. The replay of this will be sent out probably in an hour. I think I have it set an hour after I close up here. You should be getting the link to watch the replay if that's something you're interested in. But you can email me any questions that you have. Just reply to any email that you've ever gotten from me. And I can answer any further questions that you have about any of these classes. And I can definitely help you decide. So thank you again for coming. And I hope to see some of you in my classes at some point. So just to recap, Glaze Mixing Essentials is open for registration ongoing. Mastering Glaze Consistency is open until Saturday. Early bird discount if you sign up today. So midnight Pacific time, the price goes up. And then the Art of Glaze Chemistry. Registration opens on Friday, March the 24th. So I hope to see some of you in my classes. If not now, sometime in the future. Do check out my blog. There's lots of free information on there. And I also have a very large Facebook group called Understanding Glazes with Sue. So if you want to join that, any glaze questions, like if you have questions about the course, please email me. But if you have questions about your glazes, you could post them into that group. It's a great group with lots of very helpful people in there. So thank you again, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.